Good evening, and welcome back to Histohispa. Tonight, we journey to a time often called the Dark Ages, though as we shall see, it was far from dark. A time of knights in shining armor, of towering castles, of monks preserving ancient knowledge. A time of faith and feudalism, of crusades and cathedrals, of peasants and kings. Close your eyes, and let your mind drift back across the centuries, to medieval Europe. The age of knights and castles. Take a deep breath. Let the present fade away. And join me, as we step into a world where honor was everything, where the church shaped every aspect of life, and where the social order seemed ordained by God Himself. We begin our journey in the ruins of the Roman Empire, and we will watch as a new civilization slowly, painfully, emerges from the chaos. To understand medieval Europe, we must first understand what came before. The Roman Empire, at its height, was the greatest civilization the Western world had ever seen. It stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Roman law, Roman engineering, Roman culture all seemed eternal, unshakable, but nothing lasts forever. By the 4th century AD, the empire was in decline. The borders were under constant pressure from Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Saxons. These tribes were not necessarily barbarians in the sense of being uncivilized. Many had been in contact with Rome for centuries, trading, serving in the Roman army, absorbing Roman culture. But they were not Roman, and they wanted what Rome had: land, wealth, security. The empire was too large, too unwieldy to defend effectively. Political instability plagued Rome. Emperors were made and unmade by the army. Civil wars erupted. The economy struggled, inflation soared, trade declined. In 395 AD, the empire was formally divided into two halves: the Western Roman Empire, with its capital at Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital at Constantinople. The eastern half would survive for another 1,000 years, becoming what we call the Byzantine Empire. But the West was doomed. In 410 AD, the Visigoths, led by King Alaric, sacked Rome. It was the first time in 800 years that the Eternal City had fallen to a foreign enemy. The shock reverberated across the empire. If Rome could fall, nothing was safe. Over the following decades, the Western Empire crumbled. One by one, the provinces fell to the invading tribes. Britain was abandoned, left to the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Gaul was overrun by the Franks and Burgundians. Spain fell to the Visigoths. North Africa was conquered by the Vandals. And in 476 AD, the last Roman emperor in the West, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. This date is often given as the fall of the Western Roman Empire, though in reality, the empire had been disintegrating for decades. What followed is sometimes called the Dark Ages, a period from roughly 500 to 1000 AD. It is called dark, not because it was necessarily more brutal or ignorant than other times, but because we know relatively little about it. Written records are scarce. Literacy declined dramatically. The infrastructure of the Roman world, roads, aqueducts, cities, fell into disrepair. Trade diminished. Population declined. But it was not a time of complete darkness. New kingdoms were forming. The Franks, under their king Clovis, established a powerful realm in what is now France. Clovis converted to Christianity, and the Frankish kingdom became a defender of the church. In Britain, the various Germanic tribes gradually coalesced into several kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia. These kingdoms were often at war with each other, but they also developed rich cultures, producing beautiful metalwork, intricate manuscripts, and epic poetry like Beowulf. In Italy, the Ostrogoths established a kingdom that, for a time, maintained some semblance of Roman order. Their king, Theodoric, was an admirer of Roman culture and tried to preserve it. But in the 6th century, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian attempted to reconquer the West. His armies, led by the brilliant general Belisarius, retook North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain. But the effort exhausted Byzantium, and the reconquest was short-lived. Italy was soon invaded by another Germanic tribe, the Lombards, who established their own kingdom in the north. Meanwhile, a new religion was spreading rapidly across the Middle East and North Africa. Islam, founded by the Prophet Muhammad in the early 7th century, united the Arab tribes and created a new empire. Within a century of Muhammad's death, Muslim armies had conquered Syria, Egypt, Persia, North Africa, and Spain. In 732 AD, a Muslim army crossed the Pyrenees into France, threatening the heart of Christian Europe. But at the Battle of Tours, the Frankish leader Charles Martel defeated the Muslims, halting their advance. This victory is often seen as a turning point, preserving Christian Europe. Charles Martel's grandson, Charlemagne, would take the Frankish kingdom to even greater heights. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, ruled from 768 to 814 AD. He was a towering figure, both literally and figuratively. He conquered vast territories, uniting much of Western Europe under his rule. He defeated the Lombards in Italy, the Saxons in Germany, and pushed back the Muslims in Spain. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans. This act symbolically revived the Western Roman Empire, though Charlemagne's empire was very different from Rome's. It was a Christian empire, deeply tied to the church. It was a feudal empire, based not on Roman law and legions, but on personal loyalty and mounted warriors. Charlemagne was not just a warrior. He was also a patron of learning. He invited scholars from across Europe to his court, establishing a palace school. He promoted literacy, encouraging the copying of ancient texts, both Christian and classical. This revival of learning is called the Carolingian Renaissance. Monasteries became centers of education and culture. Monks painstakingly copied manuscripts, preserving works that might otherwise have been lost forever. They developed a new, clearer script called Carolingian minuscule, which made reading and writing easier. Many of the ancient texts we have today survive only because medieval monks copied them. But Charlemagne's empire did not long survive his death. His son Louis the Pious struggled to hold it together. And after Louis's death, the empire was divided among his three sons. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 split the empire into three kingdoms: West Francia, which would become France, East Francia, which would become Germany, and a middle kingdom that included Italy and a strip of land between the other two. This division laid the groundwork for the political map of Europe. But the 9th and 10th centuries were a time of renewed chaos. New invaders appeared, threatening Christian Europe from all sides. From the north came the Vikings, Scandinavian warriors and traders who raided and settled across Europe. From the east came the Magyars, nomadic horsemen who terrorized Central Europe. And from the south came Muslim raiders, the Saracens, who attacked coastal towns. Europe seemed to be falling apart again, but out of this chaos, a new social and political system was emerging. Feudalism. Feudalism was the organizing principle of medieval European society. It was a system based on land, loyalty, and military service. At the top was the king. The king, in theory, owned all the land in his kingdom, but he could not govern or defend such vast territories alone. So he granted portions of land, called fiefs, to his most powerful nobles, the lords or barons. In return, these lords swore an oath of fealty, promising to provide the king with military service, usually in the form of a certain number of knights, and to give advice and support. This ceremony, where a lord knelt before the king, placed his hands between the king's hands, and swore loyalty, was called homage. The lord became the king's vassal, but the lord in turn could not manage all his land alone, so he subdivided his fief, granting portions to lesser nobles' knights, in exchange for their military service and loyalty. These knights became the lord's vassals, and so the system cascaded downward, a hierarchy of obligations and protections. At the bottom were the peasants, the vast majority of the population. Peasants did not own land. They worked the land, growing crops, raising animals, providing food for the entire society. Most peasants were serfs, bound to the land. They could not leave without their lord's permission. They owed labor service, working the lord's fields for a certain number of days each week. They paid rents in kind, giving a portion of their harvest to the lord. In return, the lord provided protection, justice, and the use of essential facilities like the mill and the oven. This system is often called manorialism. The manor was the basic economic unit, a largely self-sufficient estate. A typical manor consisted of the lord's demesne, the land he kept for himself, and the peasants' holdings, the strips of land they farmed for their own subsistence. There was also common land, used by all for grazing animals or gathering firewood. Let us visit a manor in the 11th century and see how it functioned. Picture a valley with fields, forests, and a river. On a hill overlooking the valley stands the Lord's manor house, a substantial building of timber or stone. Below, clustered around the village green, are the peasants' cottages. These are simple structures, 1 or 2 rooms, made of wattle and daub woven sticks covered with a mixture of mud, straw, and dung. The roofs are thatched with straw. Inside there is little furniture. A table, a few stools, sleeping pallets stuffed with straw. A central hearth provides heat and a place to cook, but there is no chimney, so the room is often smoky. The floor is packed earth, covered with rushes. Windows are small, covered with shutters, as glass is expensive and rare. It is a dark, cramped, uncomfortable existence by modern standards. But for the medieval peasant it is home. Let us follow a peasant family through a typical day. The family rises at dawn. There is no time to waste, the work is unending. The father, a serf named Godric, stretches his aching back. He is in his 30s, but hard labor has aged him. His wife, Maud, is already up, rekindling the fire, preparing a simple breakfast. Porridge made from barley or oats, perhaps a bit of bread, cheese if they are lucky. Their children, 3 of them, wake slowly. The oldest, a boy of 10 named Edmund, will work alongside his father today. The younger children will help their mother. After a quick meal, Godric and Edmund head to the fields. It is spring, time for planting. The fields are divided into long strips, each family farming several scattered strips. This system, called the open field system, ensured that everyone had a share of both good and poor land. Godric guides his wooden plow, pulled by a pair of oxen. The oxen are not his, they belong to the manor, and he shares their use with other peasants. Edmund walks behind, scattering seeds from a bag slung over his shoulder. Wheat and barley for bread, oats for porridge and the animals, peas and beans for protein. The work is slow, backbreaking. The plow is heavy, the oxen stubborn. By midday, Godric and Edmund are exhausted, hungry. They sit in the shade of a tree, eating bread and onions, drinking weak ale. Water is often unsafe to drink, so everyone, even children, drinks ale, a low-alcohol beverage made from fermented grain. In the afternoon, Godric must work on the Lord's demesne. He owes the Lord 3 days of labor each week. Today he is plowing the Lord's fields. It is the same work he does on his own strips, but he resents it because it takes time away from his own crops. Meanwhile, Maud is at home, tending the vegetable garden behind the cottage. Onions, cabbage, leeks, herbs. She gathers eggs from the chickens, milks the family's goat. She spins wool into thread, a never-ending task. Every spare moment is spent spinning, for cloth is essential and expensive. The younger children fetch water from the river, gather firewood, weed the garden. There is no school, no formal education. They learn by watching and doing. As evening approaches, the family gathers again in the cottage. Maud has prepared a stew, a thick pottage of vegetables and barley, with a bit of salted pork for flavor. Meat is a rare luxury for peasants, reserved for feast days. They eat from wooden bowls, using their hands and pieces of bread as utensils. After the meal, there is a brief time to rest. Godric mends a tool, Maud continues spinning, the children play a simple game. As darkness falls, the fire is banked, and the family goes to sleep, huddled together for warmth. Tomorrow will be much the same, and the day after that. This is the rhythm of peasant life, the cycles of planting and harvest, of birth and death, unchanging for generations. But the manor is not just about agriculture. There is also the church. In the center of the village stands a small stone church. It is the most substantial building in the village, a symbol of God's presence. The church is the responsibility of the priest, who is usually a peasant's son who has learned to read and write. Every Sunday, and on the many holy days that punctuate the year, the villagers gather here for Mass. The service is in Latin, which they do not understand, but the rituals are familiar, comforting. The priest's voice intoning the prayers, the smell of incense, the flickering candles. This is a connection to the divine, a reminder that there is more to existence than endless labor. The church also marks the major events of life. Baptism, marriage, burial. A baby is baptized within days of birth, for the medieval mind is haunted by the fear of infant mortality and the fate of unbaptized souls. Marriage is a public ceremony, a union blessed by the church, though for peasants it is also a practical arrangement, uniting two families, two sets of hands to work the land. And when death comes, as it comes often and suddenly, the body is buried in the churchyard, and prayers are said for the soul. The church teaches that this life is a vale of tears, a trial to be endured. True happiness awaits in the next life, for those who live virtuously and remain faithful. This belief gives meaning to suffering, makes bearable the hardships of daily life, but it also reinforces the social order. The church teaches that society is divided into three orders, each ordained by God: those who pray, the clergy; those who fight, the nobility; and those who work, the peasants. Each has their role, and to question that role is to question God's will. And so the peasants toil, accepting their lot, hoping for salvation. But what of those who fight? The knights, the warriors who defend the manor, the lord, the kingdom. Let us turn our attention to them now. Knighthood was the pinnacle of medieval military culture. Knights were mounted warriors, heavily armed and armored, trained from childhood in the arts of war. But they were more than just soldiers. They were members of a military aristocracy, bound by a code of conduct called chivalry. Let us follow the life of a boy destined to become a knight. His name is William, and he is the second son of a minor lord. As the second son, he will not inherit his father's lands, those will go to his older brother. So William's future lies in knighthood, in proving himself through martial skill and loyal service. At the age of 7, William is sent away from home. He is sent to the household of a greater lord, a friend and ally of his father. Here he will serve as a page. William's duties as a page are humble. He serves at table, carrying dishes, pouring wine. He helps the lord dress, cares for his clothing and weapons. He runs errands, delivers messages. It is a form of education, teaching him the manners and customs of the nobility. But William also begins his training in arms. He is given a wooden sword and practices striking a post, learning the basic cuts and thrusts. He learns to ride, at first on a gentle pony, then on larger horses. He watches the knights training, absorbing their skills through observation. At 14, William becomes a squire. This is a significant step. He is now assigned to a particular knight, serving as his personal attendant. William cares for the knight's armor, keeping it clean and oiled, free of rust. He cares for the knight's horses, feeding, grooming, and exercising them. And crucially, he accompanies the knight into battle, learning warfare firsthand. The training intensifies. William practices with real weapons now, though blunted for safety. He learns to fight with sword and shield, with lance and mace. He learns to move in armor, which is heavy and restrictive but provides essential protection. Armor in this period, the 11th and 12th centuries, is typically a hauberk, a long coat of mail made of thousands of interlocking iron rings. It weighs 30 or 40 pounds and covers the body from neck to knees. Underneath, a padded garment called a gambeson absorbs the impact of blows. On his head, a conical helmet with a nose guard. William learns to mount a horse while wearing this armor, a skill that requires strength and practice. He learns to couch a lance under his arm, aiming it while galloping at full speed. He learns to fight on foot, for not all battles are fought from horseback. He also learns strategy and tactics, listening as the knights discuss past battles, plan future campaigns. And he learns the code of chivalry. Chivalry is the ethical code of knighthood. It emphasizes courage, honor, loyalty, and piety. A knight should be brave, never fleeing from battle, never showing cowardice. A knight should be honorable, keeping his word, treating opponents with respect. A knight should be loyal to his lord, serving him faithfully, even unto death. And a knight should be pious, defending the church, protecting the weak, especially women and the poor. Of course, reality often fell short of the ideal. Many knights were brutal, greedy, and self-serving. Warfare was often savage, and the rules of chivalry applied mainly to fellow knights, not to peasants or townspeople. But the ideal was powerful, shaping behavior and aspirations. At the age of 21, if he has proven himself worthy, William is dubbed a knight. The ceremony is elaborate, steeped in ritual and symbolism. The night before, William keeps a vigil in the chapel, praying, reflecting on the responsibilities he is about to assume. He is dressed in white, symbolizing purity. In the morning, he attends Mass, receiving communion. Then, before the assembled lords and knights, he kneels before his lord. The Lord takes a sword, blessed by the priest, and taps William on each shoulder, saying, "In the name of God, Saint Michael, and Saint George, I dub thee knight. Be brave, loyal, and true." William rises, now a knight. He is given his sword, his spurs, and often a piece of land or an annual income to support himself, for knighthood is expensive. A warhorse, a destrier, costs a fortune, equivalent to several years' income for a peasant. Armor must be maintained, replaced when damaged. Weapons must be of high quality, and a knight is expected to live in a manner befitting his status, with fine clothes, good food, and a retinue of servants and squires. But being a knight is also dangerous. Knights are the shock troops of medieval warfare. When armies meet, the knights charge, lances leveled, a thundering wall of horseflesh and steel. The impact is devastating. Lances shatter, horses collide, men are thrown to the ground. Then it is close combat, swords flashing, maces crushing helmets, axes chopping through mail. It is chaotic, terrifying, exhilarating. Many knights die in battle, or from wounds that fester and kill days or weeks later. Others are captured, held for ransom, for a knight's life is valuable. But there is also glory. A knight who distinguishes himself in battle earns fame, respect, land, and wealth. He might be granted a larger fief, invited to join the royal household, even marry into a powerful family. For younger sons like William, knighthood is the path to fortune. When not at war, knights train. They participate in tournaments, elaborate mock battles that test skill and courage. Tournaments are immensely popular, attracting knights from across Europe. The most common event is the joust, where two knights charge at each other with lances, trying to unhorse their opponent. Points are scored for striking the opponent's shield, for breaking a lance, for unhorsing him. It is dangerous, knights are injured, sometimes killed, even in these mock combats. But it is also a chance to display prowess, to win prizes, to catch the eye of lords looking for skilled warriors. There are also melees, chaotic free-for-alls where teams of knights fight, often over large areas, even entire fields. These resemble real battles, and are correspondingly dangerous. The church disapproves of tournaments, seeing them as wasteful and sinful. But they are too popular, too deeply ingrained in knightly culture, to be suppressed. Knights also hunt, both for sport and to provide food. Hunting is a training exercise, teaching horsemanship, strategy, and the use of weapons. Deer, boar, and even bears are hunted, often with the help of trained dogs and hawks. Falconry, the use of trained birds of prey, is especially popular among the nobility. A fine falcon is a prized possession, a status symbol. In the evening, knights gather in the great hall of the Lord's castle. Here there is feasting, drinking, music, and storytelling. Minstrels sing songs of great heroes Charlemagne, Roland, King Arthur. These songs, called chansons de geste, celebrate the ideals of knighthood, inspiring young knights to emulate the heroes of old. And here, courtly love flourishes. Courtly love is a romanticized, idealized form of love, often directed at a lady of higher status, frequently the lord's wife. It is usually chaste, or at least presented as such, more about adoration and service than physical consummation. A knight might dedicate his deeds to his lady, wearing her colors in battle or in tournaments. Poets and troubadours composed elaborate verses praising their lady's beauty, grace, and virtue. This culture of courtly love softened the rough edges of knightly society, introducing notions of refinement, courtesy, and respect for women. At least in theory. In practice, women were still largely subordinate, their lives controlled by fathers, husbands, and brothers. But the ideal was influential, shaping literature and behavior. The life of a knight, then, was one of training, warfare, and adherence to a code. It was a life of privilege, but also of obligation and danger. Knights were the defenders of Christendom, the sword arm of the feudal system. And nowhere is their role more visible than in the castles they defended. Castles are perhaps the most iconic symbol of the Middle Ages. These massive stone structures dominate the landscape, symbols of power, security, and lordship. But castles were not always made of stone, and they served multiple purposes. Let us explore the evolution and function of medieval castles. The earliest castles, built in the 9th and 10th centuries, were simple wooden structures. A motte and bailey castle consisted of a wooden tower, called a keep, built on top of a man-made hill, the motte. Surrounding the motte was a courtyard, the bailey, enclosed by a wooden palisade and a ditch or moat. These castles could be built quickly, often in just a few weeks, making them ideal for securing newly conquered territories. But they were vulnerable to fire and rot. By the 11th century, lords began building in stone. Stone castles were far more durable and defensible. The keep, or donjon, was now a massive stone tower, several stories high. It had thick walls, sometimes 10 or 15 feet thick, capable of withstanding assault. The entrance was often on the second floor, reached by a wooden staircase that could be removed in case of attack. Narrow windows, little more than slits, allowed defenders to shoot arrows while minimizing exposure. The keep was the heart of the castle, the last refuge if the outer defenses fell. It contained the lord's private chambers, a great hall for gatherings, and storage for food and weapons. Below were dark, dank dungeons, where prisoners were held. Surrounding the keep were one or more curtain walls, high stone walls with towers at intervals. These towers provided platforms for defenders and created overlapping fields of fire. Attackers approaching the wall would be shot at from multiple angles. The walls were topped with battlements, crenellations that provided cover for defenders, while allowing them to shoot or throw missiles at attackers. Between the battlements were gaps called embrasures or crenels. Behind the battlements, a walkway allowed defenders to move along the wall. The castle entrance was the most vulnerable point, so it was heavily fortified. A gatehouse, often a massive structure with its own towers, controlled access. The gate itself was made of heavy timber, reinforced with iron. Behind it, a portcullis, a heavy iron grate, could be dropped to block entry, and above the entrance, murder holes allowed defenders to pour boiling water, hot sand, or stones onto anyone trying to break through. Beyond the gate, a drawbridge might span a moat or ditch. The drawbridge could be raised, cutting off access. Moats were not always filled with water. Sometimes they were simply deep ditches, making approach difficult. Inside the castle, life was surprisingly crowded and communal. The Great Hall was the center of daily life. It was a large, open room with a high ceiling, often with a central hearth for heat. Here, the lord and his household ate, conducted business, and entertained guests. Long tables were set up for meals. The lord sat at the high table, often on a raised platform, with his family and honored guests. Lower tables accommodated knights, squires, and servants. Meals were elaborate affairs, at least for the nobility. Multiple courses, meats roasted and boiled, fish, pies, bread, cheese, fruit. Wine and ale flowed freely. Servants bustled about, musicians played, jugglers and acrobats might perform. But the great hall was also a sleeping space. After the meal, the tables were cleared away, and straw mattresses were laid out. Most of the household slept here, on the floor or on benches. Only the lord and his family had private chambers. Privacy was a luxury, almost unknown to most people. The lord's solar, his private living space, was usually on an upper floor of the keep or in a separate building. It was more comfortable, with a fireplace, glazed windows, tapestries on the walls, and a proper bed. But even here, servants were constantly present, attending to the lord's needs. Castles were not just military structures, they were also administrative centers. The lord held court here, dispensing justice, settling disputes, collecting taxes. A castle might have a chapel, where mass was said daily, a chapel often richly decorated, a place of beauty and sanctity. There were storerooms packed with grain, salted meat, barrels of ale, firewood, and weapons. A castle needed to be self-sufficient, capable of withstanding a siege lasting months. There were workshops, a smithy for repairing weapons and tools, a carpenter's shop, perhaps a brewery and a bakery. And there were stables, housing the lord's war horses, and the many other horses needed for transport and labor. Life in a castle was far from comfortable by modern standards. The stone walls, while strong, were cold and damp. Heating was provided by fireplaces, but they were inefficient, and most rooms were chilly. Tapestries hung on the walls helped insulate and added color, but drafts were everywhere. Sanitation was primitive. Toilets, called garderobes, were small rooms with a hole in the floor. Waste dropped down a chute into the moat or a cesspit. The smell, especially in summer, was overwhelming. Bathing was infrequent, though not as rare as sometimes claimed. The wealthy might bathe once a week, in a wooden tub filled with heated water. Soap, made from animal fat and lye, was available, though expensive. Despite the discomforts, Castles were symbols of power and permanence. They asserted the lord's dominance over the landscape, a constant reminder of his authority. Castles also played a crucial role in warfare. They controlled key routes, river crossings, mountain passes. They provided refuge for the population in times of invasion, and they were incredibly difficult to capture. A well-provisioned castle could hold out for months, even years, against a besieging army. Attackers had several options, none of them easy. They could try to scale the walls with ladders, but this exposed them to defensive fire and was extremely dangerous. They could try to break down the gate with a battering ram, a massive log swung on ropes or chains. But the defenders would pour boiling liquids or drop stones on the attackers. They could try to mine under the walls, digging a tunnel, propping it up with wooden beams, then setting fire to the beams. When the beams burned through, the tunnel would collapse, and with it, a section of the wall. But mining was slow, difficult work, and the defenders might counter-mine, digging their own tunnels to intercept and fight the attackers underground. They could use siege engines. The trebuchet, a giant catapult, could hurl massive stones, smashing walls, towers, and buildings. But building a trebuchet took time and skilled engineers, and castles were built with thick walls, designed to absorb such punishment. Often, the most effective strategy was simply to starve the defenders out. Surround the castle, cut off supplies, and wait. Hunger, disease, and despair would eventually force surrender. But this required patience and resources that many attackers lacked. So castles were formidable obstacles. They shaped the nature of medieval warfare, making conquest a slow, grinding process. And they were home to the lords who ruled medieval society. Lords who lived at the top of the feudal hierarchy, wielding power over the lands and people below them. The lord of a manor, the master of a castle, was a powerful figure. He was a landowner, a military commander, a judge, and a political leader. His word was law within his domain. But his power came with responsibilities. A lord owed military service to his own lord and ultimately to the king. When called, he had to provide a certain number of knights, equipped and ready for battle. He had to attend the king's court, offer advice, participate in councils. He had to administer justice, hearing disputes, punishing crimes, maintaining order. And he had to manage his estates, ensuring they were productive, profitable, and secure. This was no small task. A large estate might include several manors, each with its own village, fields, and peasants. The lord employed stewards and bailiffs to oversee daily operations, collect rents, and supervise labor. But the lord had to make the major decisions, approve expenditures, settle disputes between his officials. A wise lord cultivated good relations with his vassals and peasants. A harsh, greedy lord might face resentment, even rebellion. A generous lord, who protected his people, dispensed justice fairly, and showed magnanimity, could inspire loyalty and devotion. The lord's wife, the lady, also had significant responsibilities. In the lord's absence, often for months or even years when he was away at war or on crusade, the lady managed the estate. She oversaw the household, supervised servants, managed supplies, and ensured the castle's smooth functioning. She might also have to defend the castle if it came under attack, directing the garrison, rationing supplies, maintaining morale. There are numerous accounts of ladies successfully defending castles against besiegers. In peacetime, the lady managed the domestic side of castle life. She oversaw the preparation of meals, the making of clothing, the education of children. She was responsible for the castle's gardens, which provided vegetables, herbs for medicine and cooking, and flowers for decoration. She also had a role in managing the estate's economy. Spinning, weaving, and cloth production were often done within the castle, supervised by the lady. Cloth was valuable, used not just for clothing but also as a form of currency and trade good. The lady might also have her own lands, brought to the marriage as a dowry. She could manage these lands, collect rents, and use the income as she saw fit. Noble marriages were political and economic alliances. They were arranged by families to consolidate power, forge alliances, or settle disputes. Love was not a primary consideration, though affection might develop over time. A noblewoman's life was constrained by the expectations of her gender and class. She was expected to be chaste, obedient, pious, and fertile. Her primary duty was to produce heirs, especially sons to inherit lands and titles. Childbirth was dangerous, and many women died in labor or from complications. Those who survived might bear many children, though infant and child mortality was high. Despite these constraints, noblewomen could wield considerable influence. They might serve as advisors to their husbands, mediators in disputes, patrons of artists and scholars. Some became powerful in their own right, ruling territories as widows or regents for young sons. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who lived in the 12th century, is a famous example. She was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Europe. She was married first to Louis VII of France, then to Henry II of England, and was the mother of several kings, including Richard the Lionheart and John. She was politically astute, leading armies, negotiating treaties, and even briefly rebelling against her husband. Education for noble children was important, though it differed by gender. Boys were trained for warfare and governance, as we have seen with the path to knighthood. They also learned to read and write, at least in their native language, and sometimes in Latin. They studied history, especially the deeds of great warriors and kings, and learned the customs and laws of their land. Girls were educated in the skills necessary to manage a noble household. They learned to read and write, often more proficiently than boys, as literacy was more essential to their domestic and administrative roles. They studied music, singing, and playing instruments like the harp or lute. They learned embroidery and needlework, creating the elaborate tapestries and vestments that decorated castles and churches. And they were instructed in the arts of courtly behavior, how to conduct themselves in the sophisticated, often cutthroat, world of noble society. Religion permeated noble life, just as it did the lives of peasants. Lords and ladies attended Mass regularly, supported the church through donations, and endowed monasteries and convents. Many nobles went on pilgrimage, traveling to holy sites like Jerusalem, Rome, or Santiago de Compostela in Spain. These journeys were acts of piety, seeking forgiveness for sins, giving thanks for blessings, or fulfilling vows. They were also adventures, opportunities to see the world, meet other nobles, and gain prestige. Some nobles took religious vows themselves, entering monasteries or convents in later life. This was especially common for widows, who might retire to a convent, living a life of prayer and contemplation. Entertainment and leisure were important for the nobility. We have mentioned tournaments, hunting, and feasting. There were also games, chess, a game of strategy popular among the nobility, backgammon and dice, though gambling was officially frowned upon by the church. Music and poetry were highly valued. Troubadours and minstrels traveled from castle to castle, singing songs of love, heroism, and adventure. The songs of the troubadours, often in the Languedoc of southern France, celebrated courtly love, creating a culture of romance and refinement. In the winter, when travel was difficult and warfare impractical, noble households turned inward. This was the season for storytelling, for long evenings in the Great Hall, listening to tales of King Arthur and his knights, of Charlemagne and Roland, of ancient heroes and faraway lands. These stories were not just entertainment, they reinforced values, provided models of behavior, and connected the nobility to a shared cultural heritage. But the life of the nobility was not all feasting and leisure. It was also a life of constant vigilance, of managing complex relationships, of navigating the treacherous waters of feudal politics. A lord who grew too powerful might threaten his own lord, or even the king, prompting conflict. A lord who grew too weak might be attacked by ambitious neighbors, his lands seized, his family destroyed. Alliances shifted, loyalties were tested, and betrayal was always a possibility. The medieval world was one of personal relationships, of oaths and honor. But it was also a world where self-interest and ambition drove many actions. The church was the single most powerful institution in medieval Europe. It was not just a religious organization, it was a political, economic, and cultural force. The church owned vast amounts of land, perhaps a third of all land in Europe. It collected tithes, a tax of 1/10 of all produce, from every Christian. It operated courts, enforcing canon law, the church's own legal system. And it held a monopoly on salvation, claiming that only through the church and its sacraments could one reach heaven. At the head of the church was the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, considered the successor of Saint Peter, the first among the apostles. The Pope claimed authority over all Christians, including kings and emperors. This claim was not always accepted, and conflicts between popes and secular rulers were frequent. But the Pope's spiritual authority was immense. He could excommunicate individuals, cutting them off from the sacraments and the community of believers. He could place entire regions under interdict, suspending all religious services, a powerful weapon against disobedient rulers. Below the Pope was a hierarchy of bishops, each overseeing a diocese, a regional division of the Church. Bishops were often powerful nobles themselves, wielding both spiritual and temporal power. They commanded their own armies, held courts, and lived in grand palaces. Below the bishops were the parish priests, the clergy who ministered directly to the people. Parish priests were often poorly educated, sometimes barely literate. They were appointed by the local lord, who often treated the parish as a source of income. But the priest was the spiritual leader of the community, conducting mass, hearing confessions, baptizing babies, marrying couples, burying the dead. For the average person, the priest was the face of the church. The church's calendar structured the year. Sundays were days of rest and worship, though the definition of rest was flexible for peasants, who still had animals to care for. Holy days, feast days of saints, marked the year. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, the Assumption of Mary, these were major celebrations with special masses, feasts, and sometimes fairs. Lent, the 40 days before Easter, was a time of fasting and penance. Meat, eggs, and dairy were forbidden, and people ate simple, meatless meals. It was a time of reflection, of preparing spiritually for Easter, the celebration of Christ's resurrection. The sacraments were the central rituals of the Church. Baptism, usually performed in infancy, washed away original sin and made one a Christian. Confirmation, administered by a bishop, strengthened the bond with the Church. Eucharist, also called communion, was the most important sacrament, the reenactment of the Last Supper, where bread and wine were believed to become the body and blood of Christ. Penance involved confessing sins to a priest, expressing contrition, and receiving absolution, along with a penance, a punishment or good deed to make amends. Marriage was blessed by the Church, uniting a man and woman in a lifelong bond. Holy Orders was the sacrament that ordained priests, bishops, and other clergy. And extreme unction, also called last rites, was administered to the dying, preparing them for the afterlife. The Church taught that life on earth was temporary, a test. True life, eternal life, began after death. Those who lived righteously and died in a state of grace went to heaven, a place of eternal bliss in the presence of God. Those who died in sin went to hell, a place of eternal torment. But the Church also taught about purgatory, a middle state where souls were purified of their sins before entering heaven. Prayers, masses, and good deeds by the living could help the souls in purgatory, shortening their suffering. This belief made the Church essential to the living and the dead, creating a bond between generations. The Church also played a crucial role in education and culture. Monasteries and cathedral schools were the centers of learning. Monks and nuns devoted their lives to prayer, but they also copied manuscripts, preserving ancient knowledge. Without the work of these scribes, much of classical literature, philosophy, and science would have been lost. Monasteries developed libraries, some containing hundreds of volumes, a vast collection in an age when books were rare and expensive. Monks studied theology, but also grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, the liberal arts. Some monks were renowned scholars like Bede, an English monk who wrote a history of the English people, or Thomas Aquinas, a brilliant theologian who synthesized Christian doctrine with Aristotelian philosophy. Cathedral schools trained clergy, but they also educated the sons of nobles and wealthy townspeople. These schools taught reading, writing, Latin, and the basics of theology and law. Out of these schools would eventually emerge universities in cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford in the 12th and 13th centuries. The Church was also a patron of the arts. Churches and cathedrals were filled with beautiful art frescoes, sculptures, stained glass windows. These were not just decorations, they were teaching tools. Most people could not read, so images told the stories of the Bible, the lives of saints, the promise of heaven, and the horrors of hell. A stained glass window depicting the Nativity or the Crucifixion conveyed these stories in brilliant, glowing color. Music was central to worship. Gregorian chant, a form of plainchant, was sung during Mass and the monastic offices, the daily cycle of prayers. The chant was monophonic, a single melodic line, hauntingly beautiful, designed to lift the mind toward God. Later, polyphony developed, with multiple vocal lines sung simultaneously, creating complex harmonies. Composers like Lianin and Periton, working at Notre Dame in Paris, pioneered this new music. The church was not without its critics and problems. Corruption was rampant. Many clergy, from parish priests to bishops and even popes, lived lavish lifestyles, more concerned with wealth and power than spiritual duties. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, was common. Nepotism, appointing family members to positions, was widespread. Many clergy kept mistresses, despite vows of celibacy. These abuses sparked calls for reform. In the 11th century, a reform movement began, centered at the monastery of Cluny in France. The Cluniac reforms sought to restore discipline, celibacy, and spiritual focus. Monasteries reformed their rules, returning to strict observance of prayer, work, and poverty. The reform movement reached the papacy, and reformist popes like Gregory VII sought to assert the church's independence from secular rulers. The investiture controversy, a conflict between the pope and the Holy Roman Emperor over who had the right to appoint bishops, raged for decades. Eventually, a compromise was reached, but the conflict highlighted the tensions between spiritual and temporal authority. New monastic orders emerged, seeking to live more austere, spiritually focused lives. The Cistercians, founded in the late 11th century, rejected the wealth and comfort of older monasteries, living in remote locations, supporting themselves through manual labor. The Carthusians lived as hermits, each monk in his own cell, meeting only for communal prayer. And in the 13th century, the mendicant orders appeared, the Franciscans and Dominicans. These friars, as they were called, took vows of poverty and lived among the people, preaching, teaching, and caring for the poor. Saint Francis of Assisi, the founder of the Franciscans, was beloved for his humility, his love of nature, and his radical embrace of poverty. Saint Dominic founded the Dominicans to combat heresy through preaching and education. Dominicans became known as the Hounds of the Lord, zealous defenders of orthodoxy. Heresy was a constant concern for the Church. Heresy is a belief or practice that contradicts official Church doctrine. In the early Middle Ages, heresies were relatively rare, or at least not widespread. But as Europe became more prosperous and urbanized, new ideas flourished, and with them, new heresies. The Cathars, also called Albigensians, were a heretical sect in southern France. They believed in a dualistic universe, with a good spiritual God and an evil material God. They rejected the material world, the sacraments, the church hierarchy. The church launched a crusade against them, the Albigensian Crusade, in the early 13th century. It was brutal, resulting in the destruction of entire towns and the deaths of thousands. To combat heresy more systematically, the church established the Inquisition. Inquisitors, often Dominican friars, traveled from town to town, investigating accusations of heresy. They interrogated suspects, sometimes using torture, and if the accused were found guilty and refused to recant, they were handed over to secular authorities for execution, usually by burning. The Inquisition is one of the darker chapters of church history, a reminder that the church, for all its spiritual mission, was also an institution that wielded coercive power. But for most people, the church was a source of comfort, community, and meaning. It marked the rhythms of life, provided rituals for every occasion, and offered the hope of salvation. Monasticism was one of the most distinctive features of medieval Christianity. Monks and nuns were individuals who withdrew from the world, dedicating their lives to prayer, work, and contemplation. They lived in monasteries or convents, communities governed by a rule, a set of guidelines for daily life. The most influential rule was the Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century. Benedict's rule emphasized moderation, balance, and community. It prescribed a daily schedule of prayer, work, reading, and rest. The day was structured around the divine office, a cycle of prayers recited at fixed hours. Matins, in the middle of the night. Lauds at dawn. prime, terce sext none at intervals through the day, vespers in the evening, and compline before bed. These prayers, sung or chanted, took up several hours each day. Between prayers, monks worked. Benedict taught that to work is to pray, and so labor was seen as a form of worship. Monks farmed, tended orchards and gardens, raised animals. They built and maintained the monastery, which was often a large complex with a church, dormitories, a refectory for meals, a chapter house for meetings, a cloister for walking and meditation, workshops, and storage buildings. Monks also engaged in intellectual work. The scriptorium was the room where manuscripts were copied. This was painstaking work. A monk would sit at a desk, often for hours, carefully copying text from an existing manuscript onto fresh parchment or vellum. Parchment was made from animal skins, laboriously scraped, stretched, and treated. It was expensive, so every sheet was precious. The monk wrote with a quill pen, made from a goose or swan feather, dipped in ink made from oak galls, soot, or other materials. The script had to be clear, consistent, beautiful. Mistakes could be scraped off and corrected, but too many errors and the page might have to be redone. Illuminated manuscripts were even more elaborate. These featured decorated initials, borders, and illustrations, often in brilliant colors and gold leaf. Creating an illuminated manuscript could take months or even years. The results were stunning works of art, treasured by monasteries, cathedrals, and wealthy patrons. Through this work, monks preserved the knowledge of the past, not just the Bible and theological works, but also classical texts, Virgil, Cicero, Aristotle, medical treatises, mathematical works. Without the monasteries, much of this knowledge would have been lost. Monasteries were also centers of charity. They provided food, shelter, and medical care to the poor, the sick, and travelers. The monastery infirmary cared for sick monks, but also for outsiders who sought help. Monks who knew herbal medicine treated illnesses, set broken bones, and provided what comfort they could. Many monasteries ran schools, teaching local boys to read and write. Some boys would become monks, others would return to secular life, but all benefited from the education. For women, convents offered an alternative to marriage. A woman who entered a convent became a nun, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Life in a convent was similar to life in a monastery, a routine of prayer, work, and study. Nuns also copied manuscripts, though less frequently than monks. They engaged in textile production, embroidery, and other crafts. They ran schools for girls, teaching reading, writing, and domestic skills. Convents also provided a refuge for women who were widowed, unmarried, or simply seeking a spiritual life. Some convents were led by powerful abbesses, who wielded considerable authority, managing estates, negotiating with kings and bishops. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, was a polymath, a mystic, composer, writer, naturalist, and medical practitioner. Her writings on theology, natural history, and medicine were widely respected. Her musical compositions, ethereal and otherworldly, are still performed today. Monasteries and convents were not cut off from the world, despite their withdrawal. They were embedded in the social and economic fabric of medieval society. They owned lands, employed workers, traded goods. They were pilgrimage sites, attracting visitors seeking blessings, healing, or to venerate relics. Relics, physical remains of saints or objects associated with them, were highly prized. A monastery that possessed a famous relic could attract pilgrims from across Europe, bringing donations and prestige. Some monasteries became wealthy, owning vast estates, operating mills and mines, engaging in commerce. This wealth sometimes led to corruption, to a focus on material comfort rather than spiritual discipline. This tension between the ideal of poverty and the reality of wealth was a recurring issue in monastic history. It sparked reform movements, as mentioned earlier, with new orders seeking to return to a more austere, spiritually focused life. Despite these challenges, monasteries remained vital throughout the Middle Ages. They were oases of learning, piety, and stability in a world that was often chaotic and violent. Let us return to the lives of the peasants, the vast majority of medieval Europe's population. We have seen their daily work, but their lives were also shaped by the changing seasons and the rhythm of the church's calendar. The agricultural year began in autumn, after the harvest. The harvest was the most critical time of year. Success meant survival, failure meant starvation. Entire villages worked together, cutting grain with sickles, binding sheaves, carrying them to the threshing floor. The grain was threshed, beaten to separate the kernels from the chaff, then winnowed, tossed in the air so the wind carried away the light chaff, leaving the heavy grain. It was exhausting work, from dawn to dusk, for weeks. But it was also a time of community, of shared effort and shared relief when the work was done. After the harvest, there was a brief respite. The harvest festival was a time of celebration. A feast, with better food than usual, perhaps a roasted pig, fresh bread, ale flowing freely. Music, dancing, games. A rare moment of joy and relaxation. Then came autumn plowing, preparing the fields for the next planting. In medieval agriculture, fields were often divided into 3 sections. One section was planted with winter wheat or rye, sown in autumn and harvested in summer. One section was planted with spring crops, barley, oats, peas, sown in spring and harvested in late summer. And one section lay fallow, left unplanted to recover its fertility. Each year, the sections rotated, so each field had a year of rest every 3 years. This 3-field system was more efficient than the older 2-field system, increasing yields and providing a more varied diet. Winter was the hardest season. Work in the fields ceased, but there was still much to do. Animals had to be cared for, tools repaired, firewood gathered. Food was rationed carefully, for it had to last until the next harvest. Meat was often preserved by salting or smoking. Vegetables were stored in root cellars. Grain was kept in sacks or barrels, protected from rats and moisture. But no matter how careful, food often ran short by late winter. This was the hungry time when people survived on thin porridge, old bread, and hope. Many did not survive. The old, the very young, the sick, they were most vulnerable. Winter was also a time of darkness. Daylight was short, and nights were long and cold. Families huddled together for warmth, telling stories, singing songs, keeping the darkness at bay. Spring brought relief. The days grew longer, warmer. The fields were plowed and planted. Lambs and calves were born, a sign of new life. Easter, the celebration of Christ's resurrection, was the most important Christian festival. It was a time of joy after the austerity of Lent. Churches were decorated with flowers, special masses were sung, feasts were held. Eggs, forbidden during Lent, reappeared, often dyed and decorated. Spring and summer were busy seasons. Crops had to be tended, weeds pulled, vines pruned. Hay was cut and dried, to feed animals through the winter. Shearing sheep provided wool, which would be spun, woven, and made into clothing. Summer was also the season for pilgrimages and travel. Roads, muddy and impassable in winter, dried out. Peasants might make a short pilgrimage to a nearby shrine, seeking a blessing or giving thanks. Summer brought its own festivals. Midsummer, the summer solstice, was celebrated with bonfires, dancing, and merrymaking. Though a pagan tradition, the church tolerated it, rechristening it as the Feast of St. John the Baptist. Autumn brought the harvest, and the cycle began again. This rhythm, planting, growing, harvesting, shaped not just the work, but the entire worldview of medieval people. Life was cyclical, tied to nature, to the seasons, to the will of God. Change was slow, barely perceptible. A peasant lived much as his parents and grandparents had lived, and as his children and grandchildren would live. There was a deep conservatism, a respect for tradition, a suspicion of novelty. But there were also moments of joy, of community, of connection. A wedding, when 2 families were united, celebrated with feasting, music, and dancing that might last for days. A christening, welcoming a new member into the community and the church. A funeral, mourning the dead, but also celebrating their life, commending their soul to God. These moments, these rituals, gave meaning to life, connected the individual to the community to the church to God. It was a world of faith, where the divine was woven into every aspect of existence. We have journeyed through the structure of medieval society, from the lowest peasant to the highest lord, from the fields to the castles, from the parish church to the great monasteries. We have seen a world of hierarchy, of obligation, of faith. A world that seems, in many ways, alien to us. But it is a world that shaped the Europe we know today. Its institutions, its ideas, its culture all have left their mark. And as we continue our journey, we will explore the great events that shook medieval Europe. The Crusades, those holy wars that sent thousands to the distant east. The cathedrals, those soaring monuments to faith and human ambition. The universities, where a new kind of learning was born. The plagues, the wars, the transformations that would eventually bring the Middle Ages to an end. But for now, rest. Let the images of castles and knights, of monks and peasants, of faith and feudalism, settle gently in your mind. Breathe deeply, and drift towards sleep. We now turn to one of the most dramatic and consequential events of the Middle Ages: the Crusades. For nearly 200 years, European Christians launched military expeditions to the Holy Land, seeking to reclaim Jerusalem and other sacred sites from Muslim control. These campaigns were marked by religious fervor, extraordinary bravery, terrible brutality, and profound consequences that echo to this day. Let us begin at the end of the 11th century. The year is 1095. Pope Urban II stands before a great assembly at Clermont in France. Thousands have gathered: bishops, nobles, knights, common people. They listen as the Pope delivers an impassioned speech. He speaks of the plight of Christians in the East. He tells of the Byzantine Empire, the Christian empire based in Constantinople, under threat from the Seljuk Turks, Muslim warriors who have conquered much of Anatolia. He speaks of pilgrims to Jerusalem, harassed, attacked, denied access to the holy places. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built on the site where Christ was crucified and buried under Muslim control. The Pope calls for action. He calls upon the knights of Europe to set aside their petty quarrels, to stop fighting each other, and to direct their martial skills toward a holy purpose: to march to the east, to liberate Jerusalem, to restore Christian rule. In return, the Pope offers a spiritual reward. Those who take up the cross, who go on crusade, will receive remission of sins. Not just forgiveness, but the erasure of all temporal punishment for sins already confessed. For a warrior class accustomed to violence, concerned about the fate of their souls, this is an extraordinary offer. A chance to fight, to do what they do best, and to earn salvation in the process. The response is immediate and overwhelming. Men shout, "Deus vult," God wills it. Thousands pledge to take up the cross, sewing red crosses onto their clothing as a sign of their vow. Among them are great nobles: Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto. But also common knights, and even peasants, caught up in the fervor. What follows is the First Crusade, a chaotic, brutal, and ultimately successful campaign. Before the main armies depart, a wave of enthusiasm sweeps through the common people. This is the People's Crusade, led by a charismatic preacher named Peter the Hermit. Tens of thousands of peasants, poor knights, and hangers-on set off for the Holy Land. They are poorly equipped, poorly led, and largely ignorant of the distances and dangers involved. As they travel through Europe, they commit atrocities. In the Rhineland, they attack Jewish communities, massacring thousands. The Crusaders see the Jews as enemies of Christ, and in their fervor, they commit horrific violence. This is one of the darkest aspects of the Crusades, a prelude to centuries of anti-Semitic persecution. When the People's Crusade reaches Anatolia, they are quickly annihilated by the Turks. Most are killed, the rest enslaved. It is a disaster. But the main crusading armies, the armies of the nobles, are better prepared. They set out in 1096, traveling overland through the Balkans, or by sea. The journey is arduous, thousands of miles across hostile territory. The Crusaders face hunger, disease, ambush. Many die before ever reaching the Holy Land. But those who survive are hardened, determined. In 1097, the Crusaders besiege Antioch, a great city in Syria. The siege lasts for months. The Crusaders suffer terribly, facing starvation and disease. But eventually, through treachery, they gain entry. The city falls, and the Crusaders slaughter many of its inhabitants. Then, the Crusaders themselves are besieged by a relieving Muslim army. It seems they will be trapped, destroyed. But they are inspired by the discovery of a relic, said to be the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side. Whether genuine or a forgery, it galvanizes the Crusaders. They sally forth, attack the besiegers, and against all odds, they win. The victory is seen as a miracle, proof that God is with them. The Crusaders continue south, toward Jerusalem. In 1099 they reach the Holy City. Jerusalem is defended by a Muslim garrison, but after a siege lasting over a month, the Crusaders breach the walls. What follows is a massacre. The The Crusaders rampaged through the city, killing Muslims, Jews, even some Eastern Christians. The streets run with blood. Contemporary accounts speak of Crusaders wading through blood up to their ankles. It is an atrocity, even by the standards of the time. But for the Crusaders, it is a triumph. They have reclaimed the city where Christ died and rose again. They give thanks, weeping with joy, praying at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In the aftermath, the Crusaders establish 4 Crusader states: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. These are European enclaves in the Middle East, ruled by Frankish nobles, defended by Crusader knights. Life in the Crusader states is precarious. The Crusaders are vastly outnumbered, surrounded by Muslim states. To defend their territories, they build massive castles, fortresses like cracked des Chevaliers, with walls so thick they seem impregnable. They also establish military orders, unique institutions that combine monasticism with warfare. The Knights Templar, founded to protect pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, become a powerful military and financial organization. They wear white mantles with red crosses, live under monastic vows, but train as elite warriors. The Knights Hospitaller, or the Order of St. John, also combine military and charitable functions, operating hospitals and defending the faithful. The Teutonic Knights focus their efforts in the Baltic region, converting pagans by the sword. For nearly a century, the Crusader states survive, a fragile presence in a hostile land. But Muslim resistance grows. In 1144, the county of Edessa falls to a Muslim army. The news shocks Europe, and the Second Crusade is launched. Led by King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany, this crusade is a failure. The armies are defeated, many lives are lost, and little is achieved. The situation worsens in the late 12th century. A brilliant Muslim leader emerges: Saladin. Saladin is the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, a skilled commander, a devout Muslim, but also known for his chivalry and mercy. He unites the Muslim states and declares jihad, holy war, to retake Jerusalem. In 1187, at the Battle of Hattin, Saladin decisively defeats the Crusader army. The Crusader forces are destroyed, their leaders captured. Saladin then besieges Jerusalem. The city falls, but Saladin, unlike the Crusaders 90 years earlier, spares the inhabitants. Christians are allowed to leave peacefully, upon payment of a ransom. Those too poor to pay are often freed anyway. Saladin's magnanimity contrasts sharply with the earlier Crusader massacre, and he is praised even by his enemies. The fall of Jerusalem sparks the Third Crusade. This is perhaps the most famous of the Crusades, featuring legendary figures. King Richard I of England, known as Richard the Lionheart, King Philip Fatu of France, and the aged Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of Germany. Frederick drowns on the journey, a tragic end for a great warrior. Philip and Richard reach the Holy Land and besiege the city of Acre. After a long siege, the city falls. But then Philip returns to France, leaving Richard to continue alone. Richard is a brilliant general. He wins several battles against Saladin, including a stunning victory at Arsuf. But he cannot recapture Jerusalem. His army is too small, his supply lines too long. Eventually, Richard and Saladin negotiate a truce. Jerusalem remains in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims are guaranteed safe access to the holy sites. Richard returns to Europe, his mission incomplete. Subsequent crusades are less successful, and some are outright disasters. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, never even reaches the Holy Land. Instead, the Crusaders are diverted to Constantinople. Political intrigue, financial desperation, and Venetian manipulation lead the Crusaders to attack the Christian Byzantine capital. In 1204, Constantinople is sacked. The Crusaders loot the city, stealing treasures, desecrating churches, committing atrocities. It is a betrayal of the Crusades' original purpose and a devastating blow to the Byzantine Empire. The crusading ideal becomes increasingly tarnished. Later crusades achieve little. The Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh Crusades see some minor gains, but no lasting success. In 1291, the last Crusader stronghold, the city of Acre, falls to the Mamluks, a Muslim dynasty ruling Egypt and Syria. The Crusader states are no more. The Crusades are over. What were the consequences? In the short term, the Crusades resulted in immense suffering. Hundreds of thousands died Crusaders, Muslims, Jews, Eastern Christians. Entire populations were displaced. Ancient cities were destroyed. Trust between Christians and Muslims was shattered, creating animosities that persist. But there were also long-term effects. The Crusades increased contact between Europe and the Middle East. Trade expanded. European merchants, especially from Italian cities like Venice and Genoa, established trade networks, bringing spices, silk, and other luxury goods to Europe. Knowledge flowed as well. Europeans encountered Islamic science, philosophy, and medicine, often more advanced than their own. Works of Aristotle, preserved and expanded upon by Muslim scholars, were translated into Latin, sparking intellectual revival in Europe. The Crusades also changed European society. The military orders became powerful institutions. The Templars, in particular, became bankers, managing the wealth of kings and nobles. Their downfall in the early 14th century, accused of heresy and disbanded, would be dramatic. The Crusades also contributed to the decline of feudalism. Many nobles bankrupted themselves to finance their expeditions. Lands were sold, serfs freed to raise funds. And the Crusades opened Europe's eyes to the wider world, contributing to a spirit of exploration and expansion that would culminate in the Age of Discovery. But perhaps most importantly, the Crusades reveal the power of religious faith. For better or worse, belief in God, in the sacredness of Jerusalem, in the promise of salvation, motivated thousands to leave their homes, risk their lives, and endure unimaginable hardships. Faith can inspire great courage and great cruelty, and the Crusades demonstrate both. A single fire could destroy an entire neighborhood. Many towns suffered devastating fires, sometimes multiple times. Disease was also a threat. Crowded conditions, poor sanitation, and lack of clean water created ideal conditions for the spread of illness. Outbreaks of dysentery, typhus, and other diseases were common, but the greatest disaster was yet to come: the Black Death. In 1347, a terrible plague arrived in Europe. The Black Death. It came from the east, traveling along trade routes, carried by rats and fleas. The bacterium Yersinia pestis caused the disease, though medieval people did not understand this. They knew only that people were dying in vast numbers, and no one knew why or how to stop it. The plague took several forms. Bubonic plague was the most common. It caused swellings called buboes in the lymph nodes, especially in the groin, armpits, and neck. These buboes were painful, sometimes as large as an egg or an apple. Victims suffered high fever, chills, vomiting, and often died within days. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs, causing coughing, bloody sputum, and difficulty breathing. It was even more deadly and could spread directly from person to person through the air. Septicemic plague occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream, causing gangrene, blackening of the skin, and rapid death. This form was almost always fatal. The plague spread with terrifying speed. It arrived in Sicily in October 1347, brought by ships from the east. By the following spring, it had reached mainland Italy, France, and Spain. By summer, it was in England. By 1350, it had swept across almost all of Europe, reaching as far as Scandinavia and Russia. Entire villages were wiped out. In cities, the death toll was staggering. In Florence, it is estimated that half the population died. In Siena, perhaps 2/3. In some places, the dead were so numerous that they could not be buried properly. Mass graves were dug, bodies piled in without ceremony. In some towns, corpses lay in the streets, rotting, because there was no one to bury them. The social fabric began to unravel. Fear drove people apart. Families abandoned sick relatives. Priests refused to administer last rites, fearing contagion. Some fled the cities, retreating to the countryside, hoping to escape the disease, but the plague followed. People sought explanations. Some saw the plague as divine punishment, God's wrath for humanity's sins. Flagellants, bands of penitents, traveled from town to town, whipping themselves publicly, seeking to appease God. Others blamed the Jews, accusing them of poisoning wells. This led to horrific pogroms, massacres of Jewish communities across Europe. Thousands were murdered, their homes and synagogues burned. It was a tragic, irrational response to a catastrophe no one understood. Some sought scapegoats among lepers, beggars, or foreigners, anyone who seemed different or vulnerable. Others turned to superstition, wearing amulets, charms, or herbs thought to ward off the disease. Some believed that bad air miasma caused the plague, so they avoided foul smells or carried flowers and perfumes. None of these measures worked. The plague killed indiscriminately rich and poor, young and old, clergy and laity. Even kings were not immune. King Alfonso XI of Castile died of the plague while besieging Gibraltar. The death toll was immense. Estimates vary, but it is believed that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population died in the initial outbreak between 1347 and 1352. Perhaps 25 to 50 million people, and the plague did not disappear. It returned in subsequent waves every few years, well into the 17th century. Each outbreak killed thousands more, though none was as devastating as the first. The consequences of the Black Death were profound. The immediate impact was demographic catastrophe. Labor became scarce. Fields lay untilled, crops unharvested. Villages were abandoned, left to ruin. But this labor shortage shifted the balance of power. Surviving peasants and workers could demand higher wages. Lords, desperate for labor, were forced to offer better terms, lower rents, higher pay, more freedom. Serfdom began to decline in many areas. Peasants negotiated for their freedom or simply left, moving to areas where conditions were better. In England, the Statute of Labourers, passed in 1351, tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict the movement of workers. But it was difficult to enforce, and resentment simmered. This contributed to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when English peasants rose up, demanding an end to serfdom and oppressive taxes. The revolt was crushed, its leaders executed, but it signaled a shift. The old feudal order was breaking down. The economy also changed. With fewer people, there was less demand for grain. Prices fell, hurting landowners. But demand for luxury goods, for meat, for wool, remained strong. Some landowners shifted from growing crops to raising sheep, which required fewer workers. This further displaced peasants, but it also made England a major wool producer, enriching merchants and eventually fueling the textile industry. The church, too, was affected. So many clergy died that there were not enough priests. Replacements were hastily trained, often poorly educated, undermining the quality of religious life. The church's inability to stop the plague, or even explain it, shook people's faith. Why had God allowed this? Where was divine mercy? Some turned to more personal, mystical forms of piety, seeking direct connection with God. Others became cynical, questioning the church's authority. This crisis of faith contributed to calls for church reform, which would eventually culminate in the Protestant Reformation. Culturally, the Black Death left a mark. Art and literature became preoccupied with death. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, depicted skeletons leading people from all walks of life, popes, kings, peasants, to the grave. The message, death comes for everyone, and earthly status means nothing. Memento mori, remember you must die, became a common theme. Tombs featured grim effigies, showing the deceased as decomposing corpses, a stark reminder of mortality. But life went on. Survivors rebuilt, adapted, carried on. And out of the devastation, new opportunities emerged. With fewer people competing for resources, those who survived often found themselves better off. They inherited land, accumulated wealth, enjoyed a higher standard of living. The late 14th and 15th centuries saw the rise of a prosperous middle class, the growth of towns, the flourishing of commerce and culture. The Black Death was a catastrophe, but it also, paradoxically, contributed to the transformation of medieval society, hastening the end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of a new era. Amidst the warfare, the plagues, and the social upheavals, there was also a remarkable intellectual flowering in the later Middle Ages. Universities were born. These institutions of higher learning, unique to medieval Europe, would shape Western education for centuries to come. Before universities, education was primarily the domain of the church. Cathedral schools and monastic schools trained clergy, teaching Latin, theology, and the liberal arts. But by the 12th century, there was a growing demand for learning, especially in law, medicine, and philosophy. Scholars began to gather in certain cities, attracted by renowned teachers. Students flocked to hear these masters lecture. Over time, these informal gatherings became organized. The word university comes from the Latin universitas, meaning a corporation or guild. Medieval universities were essentially guilds of scholars, both masters and students. banding together for mutual support and protection. They sought and received charters from kings, popes, or local authorities, granting them autonomy, legal privileges, and the right to confer degrees. The University of Bologna in Italy, founded around 1088, is often considered the first university. It specialized in law, particularly Roman law and canon law, the law of the Church. Students came from across Europe to study under famous legal scholars. The University of Paris, which emerged around 1150, became renowned for theology and philosophy. Here, the great debates of the age were argued: the nature of God, the relationship between faith and reason, the problem of universals. Oxford and Cambridge in England were founded in the 12th and 13th centuries. Other universities soon followed at Salamanca in Spain, Padua in Italy, Prague in Bohemia, Heidelberg in Germany. By the end of the Middle Ages, there were dozens of universities across Europe. Life at a medieval university was demanding. Students, often as young as 14, arrived in the university town, far from home. They lived in boarding houses or, later, in colleges, residential communities founded by wealthy patrons to support poor students. The language of instruction was Latin, the international language of scholarship. A student from Poland could attend lectures in Paris or Bologna and understand everything, for all lectures, texts and debates were in Latin. The curriculum was based on the trivium and quadrivium, the 7 liberal arts inherited from antiquity. The trivium consisted of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. The quadrivium consisted of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. A student would first study these arts, earning a bachelor's degree, which took about 4 years. Then, he could pursue advanced study in one of the higher faculties: law, medicine, or theology. Earning a master's or doctoral degree could take many more years. Lectures were the primary method of instruction. The master sat in a chair, the cathedra, from which we get the word cathedral, meaning the seat of a bishop, but also the word for a professor's chair. The master read from a text, often a work by an ancient authority like Aristotle or the Bible, and provided commentary, explaining, interpreting, and elaborating. Students sat on the floor or on benches, taking notes, memorizing. Books were rare and expensive, so students had to rely on their memories and their notes. Disputations were also important. These were formal debates where a question was posed, and students or masters argued for and against a particular position. The disputation trained students in logic, rhetoric, and the art of argument. The most famous disputations could draw large crowds, becoming public intellectual spectacles. The rediscovery of Aristotle's works was a major intellectual event. For centuries, Western Europe had known only a few of Aristotle's logical works. But in the 12th and 13th centuries, the rest of his corpus was translated into Latin, from Arabic and Greek. These included his works on physics, metaphysics, ethics, politics, and biology. Aristotle's philosophy was comprehensive, systematic, and rational. It offered explanations for the natural world, for human behavior, for the structure of reality. But it was also pagan, written by a Greek philosopher who knew nothing of Christianity. How could Aristotle's teachings be reconciled with Christian faith? This was the great challenge facing medieval scholars. Some, like the theologians at the University of Paris, were suspicious of Aristotle. They worried that his ideas, particularly his views on the eternity of the world and the nature of the soul, contradicted Christian doctrine. At one point, teaching certain Aristotelian doctrines was even forbidden at Paris. But others saw the potential. If Aristotle's philosophy, the pinnacle of human reason, could be harmonized with Christian revelation, the result would be a powerful synthesis. The greatest medieval philosopher, Thomas Aquinas, achieved this synthesis. Aquinas, a Dominican friar, spent his life studying, teaching, and writing. His masterwork, the Summa Theologica, is a monumental attempt to systematize all of Christian theology, using Aristotelian philosophy as the framework. Aquinas argued that faith and reason are not opposed but complementary. Reason, represented by philosophy, can discover many truths about God and the world. But some truths, like the Trinity or the Incarnation, are beyond reason and can only be known through revelation. Aquinas' synthesis became the foundation of Catholic theology, and his influence persists to this day. But not everyone agreed with Aquinas. Other thinkers like Duns Scotus and William of Ockham questioned his methods and conclusions. Ockham, in particular, was skeptical of the ability of reason to prove theological truths. He favored a more empirical approach, focusing on what could be observed and tested. His principle, known as Ockham's razor, states that the simplest explanation is usually the best, and unnecessary entities should not be multiplied. This principle would later influence the development of modern science. Universities were not just centers of abstract thought. They also produced practical knowledge. In medicine, scholars studied the works of ancient physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, as well as the more recent works of Islamic physicians like Avicenna and Rhazes. They learned anatomy, though dissection was rare and controversial. They studied the humoral theory, which held that the body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness resulted from an imbalance of these humors. Treatment involved restoring balance through diet, bloodletting, purging, and the use of medicinal herbs. By modern standards, medieval medicine was often ineffective, sometimes harmful. But it was a serious, scholarly pursuit, and some physicians achieved remarkable insights. In law, universities trained lawyers and judges, who would go on to serve kings, popes, and cities. The revival of Roman law, studied intensively at Bologna, influenced legal systems across Europe, providing a rational, systematic alternative to the patchwork of local customs. Canon law, the law of the Church, was also studied and codified, creating a vast legal system that governed the lives of all Christians. Universities fostered a culture of debate, inquiry, and intellectual ambition. They produced a new class of educated laymen, who would go on to serve in government, the church, and the emerging professions. And they laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, which would transform the world in the centuries to come. In the 12th and 13th centuries, a new style of architecture emerged that would define the late Middle Ages: Gothic. Gothic cathedrals are among the most awe-inspiring buildings ever constructed. Soaring spires, massive stained glass windows, intricate sculptures, these structures seem to defy gravity, reaching toward heaven. They were built to glorify God, to inspire the faithful, and to demonstrate the wealth and power of the cities that built them. Let us explore how and why these magnificent buildings came to be. The Gothic style emerged in the region around Paris, in the mid-12th century. The abbot Suger of Saint Denis, a monastery just outside Paris, is often credited as the father of Gothic architecture. Suger wanted to rebuild the abbey church, making it a fitting shrine for the relics of Saint Denis, the patron saint of France. He envisioned a church filled with light, a foretaste of the heavenly Jerusalem. To achieve this, he employed several architectural innovations. The pointed arch, borrowed from Islamic architecture, allowed for taller, more flexible structures. Unlike the round arches of Romanesque architecture, pointed arches could be varied in height while covering the same span. The ribbed vault, a framework of stone ribs supporting the ceiling, distributed weight more efficiently, allowing for thinner walls and larger windows. And the flying buttress, an external support structure, transferred the weight of the roof and walls outward and downward to massive piers outside the building. This allowed the walls themselves to be opened up, filled with glass. The result was a church unlike any seen before. When Suger's new choir was dedicated in 1144, visitors were astonished. The interior seemed to glow, filled with colored light streaming through stained glass windows. The ceiling soared overhead, giving a sense of vast, ethereal space. It was, as Suger intended, a glimpse of heaven. The Gothic style spread rapidly. Bishops, cities, and monarchs competed to build ever grander cathedrals. Notre Dame de Paris, begun in 1163, was one of the first great Gothic cathedrals. It featured two massive towers on the west facade, a large rose window, and a spacious interior capable of holding thousands of worshippers. Chartres Cathedral, southwest of Paris, was rebuilt after a fire in 1194. The new cathedral was even more ambitious. It had 9 towers, though only 2 were completed. Its stained glass windows are among the finest in the world, depicting biblical stories, saints, and scenes from medieval life in brilliant blues, reds, and golds. The windows were not just beautiful, they were educational. For a largely illiterate population, the images told the stories of the Bible, the lives of saints, the moral lessons of Christianity. Worshippers could read these windows, learning the faith through art. Reims Cathedral, where French kings were crowned, was another masterpiece. Its west facade is covered with sculptures, hundreds of figures depicting Christ, the Virgin Mary, angels, apostles, saints, and even kings and queens. These sculptures were originally painted in vivid colors, though the paint has long since worn away. Amiens Cathedral, completed in the 13th century, is the tallest Gothic cathedral in France, with a nave ceiling reaching over 140 feet. The sense of height is dizzying, pulling the eye and the soul upward. In Germany, Cologne Cathedral, though not completed until the 19th century, followed the Gothic model on an immense scale. In England, the Gothic style took on distinctive characteristics. Canterbury, York, and Westminster Abbey are among the finest examples. English Gothic often featured elaborate fan vaulting, where the ribs of the vault spread out like the ribs of a fan, creating intricate patterns. Building a cathedral was an enormous undertaking, taking decades, sometimes centuries. It required the labor of hundreds, even thousands, of workers: stonemasons, carpenters, glaziers, sculptors, laborers. Master masons, the architects of the time, designed the buildings, calculating proportions, angles, and stresses. They worked without modern tools: no steel, no power tools, no computers. They relied on geometry, experience, and a deep understanding of how stone and mortar behaved. Stone had to be quarried, cut, and transported, often from distant sites. Massive blocks of limestone or sandstone were shaped by masons, each stone fitted precisely to its place. Timber was needed for scaffolding, for the wooden frameworks on which vaults were constructed, and for the roofs. Glass was made by melting sand with potash and coloring agents, then blowing or casting it into sheets. Pieces of colored glass were cut to shape and held together with lead strips, forming the images and patterns of the stained glass windows. This required incredible skill and artistry. The cost was staggering. A cathedral could cost the equivalent of many years' revenue for an entire city. But the investment was considered worth it. A magnificent cathedral brought prestige, attracted pilgrims, and demonstrated the city's devotion to God. Pilgrims, coming to venerate relics or seek blessings, brought money, spending on lodging, food, and offerings. Cities competed to house important relics, which drew pilgrims and enhanced reputation. The construction of a cathedral was also a communal effort. Wealthy patrons donated money. Guilds contributed funds and labor, often paying for specific windows or chapels. Ordinary citizens volunteered, hauling stones, digging foundations, providing whatever help they could. It was an act of collective piety, a physical manifestation of faith. Inside a Gothic cathedral, the experience is overwhelming. Enter through the west portal, the main entrance. Above, a tympanum, a semi-circular relief sculpture, often depicts the Last Judgment. Christ sits in majesty, judging the living and the dead. The saved rise to heaven on one side, while the damned are dragged to hell on the other. It is a vivid reminder of the stakes of the Christian life. Inside, the nave stretches ahead, a vast open space. Rows of columns march toward the altar, each topped with intricately carved capitals. Overhead, the ribbed vault, painted or left stone gray, creates patterns and shadows. Light streams in through the windows, casting colored patterns on the floor and walls. The atmosphere is hushed, reverent. The sound of footsteps echoes. Voices are subdued. At the far end, the choir and the altar. This is the sacred heart of the cathedral, where the Mass is celebrated, where the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. The altar is often richly decorated, with precious metals, jewels, embroidered cloths. Behind it, the apse, often featuring more stained glass, depicting the Virgin Mary or Christ. Side chapels line the walls, each dedicated to a saint, each with its own altar, sculptures, and relics. Pilgrims move from chapel to chapel, praying, lighting candles, leaving offerings. The cathedral is not just a building, it is a space filled with the presence of God, a place where the earthly and the divine meet. Gothic cathedrals also served civic functions. They were gathering places where the community assembled for major events. Markets were held in the square outside. Councils met in the cathedral or in adjacent buildings. The cathedral was the center of urban life, physically and spiritually, but cathedrals were also fragile. Fire was a constant threat. Wooden roofs, candles, lightning strikes all posed dangers. Many cathedrals suffered fires, requiring costly rebuilding. Wars, revolutions, and neglect took their toll. Some cathedrals were damaged or destroyed, their stones repurposed, their treasures looted. But many survived, and they remain today, testaments to the faith, the skill, and the ambition of medieval people. Standing in a Gothic cathedral, looking up at the soaring vaults, the light streaming through ancient glass, one can glimpse what the builders intended. A foretaste of heaven. A sense of the infinite, the eternal, the divine. In 1337, a conflict began that would last, intermittently, for over a century. The 100 Years' War, fought between England and France, was a series of battles, sieges, and campaigns that devastated France and transformed both kingdoms. The causes were complex, rooted in feudal relationships, territorial disputes, and dynastic claims. The English kings held lands in France, a legacy of the Norman conquest and subsequent marriages. They were vassals of the French king for these lands, but they were also kings in their own right. This created tension and confusion. Who held ultimate authority? In 1328, the French king Charles IV died without a male heir. The French nobility chose his cousin, Philip V, as the new king. But Edward III of England, whose mother was Charles's sister, claimed that he had a better right to the French throne. The French rejected his claim, invoking Salic law, which barred inheritance through the female line. Edward pressed his claim anyway, and in 1337 he invaded France. Thus began the 100 Years' War. The early phase of the war went well for England. At the Battle of Cressy in 1346, the English won a stunning victory. The English army was outnumbered, but it was well positioned and disciplined. The English longbow proved devastatingly effective. English archers, common soldiers, could shoot arrows rapidly and accurately, penetrating armor at long range. The French knights, charging on horseback, were cut down before they could reach the English lines. It was a humiliation for the French aristocracy, their vaunted chivalry defeated by peasant archers. 10 years later, at Poitiers in 1356, the English won again. This time they captured the French king John II. He was held for ransom, and France had to pay an enormous sum to secure his release. The cost crippled the French economy and further destabilized the kingdom. But France did not collapse. Under the leadership of Charles V, who became king in 1364, France recovered. Charles avoided open battles, where the English longbow gave them an advantage. Instead, he used a strategy of attrition, guerrilla tactics, and fortifications. French forces harassed the English, recaptured castles, and slowly pushed them back. By the time Charles died in 1380, much of the territory lost earlier had been regained. The war then entered a lull, as both kingdoms dealt with internal problems. England faced the peasants' revolt and political instability. France was torn by civil war between rival factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. In 1415, the English king Henry VI saw an opportunity and invaded France again. At the Battle of Agincourt, the English, once again heavily outnumbered, won a spectacular victory. Henry's archers and dismounted men-at-arms defeated the French knights in a muddy, chaotic battle. Henry went on to conquer much of northern France, and by the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, he was recognized as heir to the French throne. It seemed that England had won. But Henry died in 1422, and his infant son, Henry VI, inherited the throne. France was not yet defeated. At this dark hour, a remarkable figure emerged: Joan of Arc. Joan was a peasant girl from the village of Domremy. She claimed to have visions, to hear the voices of saints, telling her that she was chosen by God to save France. She convinced the Dauphin, the French prince, to let her accompany the army. In 1429, Joan led French forces to relieve the besieged city of Orleans. Her presence inspired the soldiers, and the English were driven back. It was a turning point. Joan then accompanied the Dauphin to Reims, where he was crowned King Charles VII, legitimizing his rule. But Joan's success was short-lived. In 1430, she was captured by the Burgundians, allies of the English, and sold to the English. She was tried for heresy, accused of witchcraft and dressing in men's clothing, a violation of church law. The trial was a sham driven by political motives. In 1431, at the age of 19, Joan was burned at the stake in Rouen, but her legacy endured. She had revived French morale, given them hope, and turned the tide of the war. Charles VII, inspired by Joan and aided by capable commanders, gradually pushed the English out of France. He reformed the French army, creating a more professional force, with paid soldiers rather than relying solely on feudal levies. He improved artillery, using cannons to reduce English-held castles. By 1453, the English had been driven from France, retaining only the port of Calais. The 100 Years' War was over. The war had profound consequences. For France, it fostered a sense of national identity. The struggle against the English united the French, transcending regional and feudal loyalties. Joan of Arc became a symbol of French nationalism, a martyr and a hero. For England, the loss was devastating. The dream of a dual monarchy, ruling both England and France, was shattered. The war bankrupted the crown, discredited the nobility, and contributed to the outbreak of civil war, the Wars of the Roses, which would tear England apart for decades. Militarily, the war demonstrated the decline of the feudal knight. Infantry, especially archers and pikemen, proved they could defeat mounted knights. Gunpowder weapons, though still primitive, began to change the nature of warfare. Cannons could breach castle walls, rendering the great fortresses of the Middle Ages obsolete. Socially, the war accelerated the decline of feudalism. The need for money to pay soldiers led to increased taxation, which strengthened royal power at the expense of the nobility. The old feudal levies, where knights served their lords for a fixed period, were replaced by paid armies, professional soldiers loyal to whoever paid them. The 100 Years' War, brutal and destructive as it was, marked the end of the medieval world and the beginning of the early modern period. By the mid-15th century, the world that had existed for 1,000 years was changing. The Middle Ages were drawing to a close. Several factors contributed to this transformation. The Black Death had shattered the old social order, weakening feudalism, empowering peasants and workers, and undermining the church's authority. The 100 Years' War had fostered national identities, strengthened royal power, and changed the nature of warfare. The growth of towns and trade had created a wealthy, ambitious middle class, less bound by feudal ties. Universities had spread learning, fostering critical thinking and challenging traditional authorities, and new technologies were emerging that would change everything. Gunpowder, as mentioned, revolutionized warfare. Cannons could destroy castles, guns could kill knights. The military dominance of the armored, mounted knight, which had defined the Middle Ages, was ending. Warfare became more dependent on infantry, artillery, and tactics, favoring centralized states over feudal levies. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century, was even more revolutionary. Before the printing press, books were copied by hand, a slow, expensive process. A single book could take months to produce, and only the wealthy could afford large libraries. The printing press, using movable type, allowed for the rapid, cheap production of books. Suddenly, knowledge could be disseminated widely. The Bible, previously accessible only in Latin and to the clergy, could be printed in vernacular languages, allowing ordinary people to read it. This would fuel the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, as reformers like Martin Luther challenged the Catholic Church's authority. But the printing press also spread other knowledge, scientific treatises, classical texts, news, and eventually, newspapers. It democratized learning, making education more accessible, and accelerated the pace of intellectual and cultural change. Exploration was also transforming the world. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain, reached the Americas. He believed he had found a route to Asia, but he had actually stumbled upon a new world, unknown to Europeans. The discovery or invasion, from the perspective of indigenous peoples of the Americas, would have profound consequences. It led to the Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the Old World and the New. Crops like potatoes, maize, and tomatoes, brought from the Americas, would eventually become staples in Europe, supporting population growth. But the exchange also brought devastating diseases to the Americas. Indigenous populations, with no immunity to smallpox, measles, and other European diseases, died in vast numbers, perhaps 90% of the population. It was a demographic catastrophe, even greater than the Black Death in Europe. The discovery of the Americas also led to European colonization, the exploitation of resources, the transatlantic slave trade, and centuries of conflict and cultural transformation. The Age of Exploration, as it is called, was driven by several factors. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 closed overland trade routes to Asia, prompting European merchants to seek alternative sea routes. Advances in navigation, shipbuilding, and cartography made long ocean voyages feasible. And there was ambition, a desire for wealth, for glory, for spreading Christianity. Portuguese explorers sailed down the coast of Africa, reaching India in 1498. Spanish conquistadors conquered the Aztec and Inca empires, claiming vast territories in the Americas. The world was becoming connected for better and worse. In Europe, the Renaissance was beginning. Renaissance means rebirth, and it refers to a renewed interest in the classical cultures of Greece and Rome. Scholars, artists, and thinkers looked back to the ancient world, seeking to recover and emulate its achievements. This was not a rejection of Christianity, but a belief that human reason, creativity, and potential could be celebrated alongside faith. The Renaissance began in Italy in the 14th century and spread northward. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael created works of stunning beauty and technical mastery. Writers like Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio wrote in the vernacular, making literature accessible to a wider audience. Humanist scholars studied ancient texts, edited them, translated them, and applied their lessons to contemporary issues. The Renaissance fostered a spirit of inquiry, innovation, and individualism. It celebrated human achievement, not just divine grace. This shift in perspective marked a break with the medieval worldview, which had emphasized human sinfulness, the transience of earthly life, and the priority of the spiritual over the material. Politically, the late Middle Ages saw the rise of powerful centralized states. Kings consolidated power, reducing the autonomy of nobles, creating professional armies, establishing bureaucracies, and claiming sovereignty over their territories. In France, after the 100 Years' War, the monarchy grew stronger, laying the groundwork for the absolute monarchies of the early modern period. In England, after the Wars of the Roses, the Tudor dynasty established a strong, centralized monarchy under Henry VII and his successors. In Spain, the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile united the two kingdoms, and the conquest of Granada in 1492 completed the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of Iberia from Muslim rule. These emerging nation-states would dominate European politics in the centuries to come. The Holy Roman Empire, in contrast, remained fragmented, a patchwork of principalities, duchies, and free cities, nominally ruled by an emperor but lacking real centralized power. The Catholic Church faced challenges from within and without. The Western Schism, from 1378 to 1417, saw two, and at times three, rival popes claiming authority, each excommunicating the others. This scandal weakened the Church's moral authority and credibility. Calls for reform grew louder. Reformers like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia criticized church corruption, questioned papal authority, and argued that the Bible, not the church hierarchy, should be the ultimate authority for Christians. Hus was burned at the stake for heresy in 1415, but his ideas would inspire future reformers. The stage was set for the Protestant Reformation, which would shatter the unity of Western Christendom in the 16th century. So, by the end of the 15th century, the medieval world was giving way to a new age. The feudal system was breaking down. The power of the church was being questioned. New technologies, new ideas, new worlds were opening up. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Exploration, all were beginning. The Middle Ages, that long period from the fall of Rome to the dawn of modernity, were over. But the legacy of the Middle Ages endures. The legal systems, the universities, the languages, the national identities, the architectural masterpieces, the literary and artistic achievements, all were shaped by the medieval experience. And the questions the medievals asked about faith and reason, about justice and power, about the meaning of life are questions we still ask today. And so, our journey through medieval Europe comes to an end. We have walked through the ruins of Rome, seen the emergence of feudalism, witnessed the making of knights and the building of castles. We have explored the power of the church, the horrors of the Black Death, the intellectual ferment of the universities, and the soaring beauty of Gothic cathedrals. We have followed crusaders to the Holy Land, watched Joan of Arc inspire a nation, and seen the old order give way to the new. The Middle Ages were a time of faith and violence, of creativity and destruction, of darkness and light. They were not a golden age, but nor were they the dark ages of myth. They were a human age, filled with people striving, suffering, creating, loving, and hoping. People not so different from us. And though the castles are now ruins, though the knights are long gone, though the world has changed beyond recognition, the echoes of the Middle Ages remain. In every church, in every law, in every book, in every university, the medieval world lives on. Rest now, and let the images of this long ago time settle in your mind. Knights in armor, monks at prayer, cathedrals reaching toward heaven, peasants working the land, merchants haggling in the market, scholars debating in the universities. Let these images carry you gently into sleep, and dream, perhaps, of a time when the world was young and everything seemed possible. Good night.